The torrential rain pounded against the locked cellar door like 1,000 angry fists as Josephine Hayes struggled to breathe in the damp, suffocating darkness. She hadn't expected Clayton Ryder, the most feared man in El Dorado, Kansas, to discover her plans to escape with the evidence that would destroy him, nor had she anticipated being thrown into this earthen prison beneath his saloon to await what he called a more permanent solution once the storm passed. El Dorado, 1874, had seen its share of lawlessness since the cattle drives began pushing through. But Josephine had never imagined she'd become entangled with the town's criminal underbelly. At 22, she had come west with dreams of independence after her father's passing left her with nothing but debts in Philadelphia. The millinery shop she'd established had been modestly successful until Ryder began demanding protection money from every business on Main Street. Josephine's fingers were raw from clawing at the wooden door. The storm that had been brewing all day had finally broken over the town with biblical fury just after sunset, sending everyone indoors and ensuring no one would hear her cries for help. Water was beginning to seep through the cracks in the foundation, pooling around her boots. If the rain continued at this rate, she realized with mounting panic, the cellar might flood completely before morning. "Help!" she screamed, knowing it was futile. The howling wind would carry her voice away. Still, she pounded, harder and more desperately as the water level crept steadily upward. "Someone, please!" Zachary Quint had not planned to be out on a night like this. The experienced cowboy had intended to wait out the storm at the boarding house, where he'd taken a room after arriving in El Dorado 3 days earlier. But Mrs. Finch's aging roof had chosen tonight of all nights to spring a leak directly over his bed, forcing him to seek shelter elsewhere. The Lucky Star Saloon was the only establishment with lights still burning through the downpour. Ducking his head against the driving rain, Zachary made his way down the muddy street, his spurs sinking into the sodden earth with each step. The wind nearly knocked him sideways as he approached the saloon, his duster providing little protection against the elements. He'd known Kansas storms could turn violent, but this one seemed determined to wash away the entire town. As he passed by the side of the building, heading for the front entrance, a sound caught his attention, something different from the howling wind and crashing thunder. He paused, water streaming from the brim of his hat, and listened. There it was again, pounding, accompanied by a faint cry that could only be human. Zachary moved toward the sound, following it to what appeared to be a cellar door set into the ground alongside the saloon. The pounding was definitely coming from inside, and now he could make out a woman's voice calling desperately for help. "Hello," he called out, kneeling in the mud beside the door. "Is someone in there?" Inside the cellar, Josephine froze at the sound of a human voice. "Yes," she cried, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm locked in. Please help me." "Stand back from the door," the unfamiliar voice instructed. "I'm going to break the lock." Josephine retreated as far as she could, which wasn't far given the rapidly rising water that now reached her calves. She heard the sound of something heavy striking metal. Once, twice, and then with a resounding crack, the padlock gave way. The cellar door flew open, revealing the silhouette of a tall man against the stormy night sky. Rain poured in around him as he reached down into the darkness. "Take my hand," he called. Without hesitation, Josephine stretched upward, her fingers connecting with his. His grip was strong and sure as he pulled her from the flooded cellar into the raging storm. She stumbled as she emerged, falling against his chest. For a moment they stood together in the downpour, her soaked skirts plastered against her legs, his duster offering minimal protection for them both. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice raised to be heard above the storm. Josephine looked up at her rescuer. Lightning flashed, illuminating a face with strong features, a straight nose and concerned eyes beneath the brim of a rain-soaked hat. "No, but we need to get away from here," she replied urgently. "The man who locked me in there, he'll kill me if he finds me." Zachary didn't question her. Something in her voice told him she was telling the truth, and his years on the frontier had taught him to trust his instincts. "My horse is at the boarding house. Can you make it that far?" Josephine nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain. Her legs felt weak after hours in the cellar, and the cold had seeped into her bones. But fear was a powerful motivator, and the thought of Ryder finding her gave her strength. "Let's go," Zachary said, placing a supportive arm around her shoulders. Together they battled against the storm, moving away from the saloon as quickly as the wind and rain would allow. Mrs. Finch was startled when Zachary returned with a half-drowned woman in tow, but the landlady's practical nature quickly overcame her surprise. Soon, Josephine was sitting before the kitchen hearth wrapped in a blanket, a cup of hot tea warming her hands while Zachary explained how he'd found her. "Locked in a cellar, you say?" Mrs. Finch clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "Who would do such a thing?" Josephine hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. She looked at Zachary, studying him properly for the first time. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with the weathered complexion of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. His dark hair was damp from the rain, and there was something reassuring in the steadiness of his gaze. "Clayton Ryder," she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He owns the Lucky Star Saloon." Mrs. Finch's face paled. "That man has brought nothing but trouble to El Dorado since he arrived last year. But why would he lock you up, dear?" "Because I found his ledger," Josephine explained, gaining confidence as she spoke. "It has records of all his illegal dealings, the protection money, the stolen cattle, even payoffs to officials in Topeka. I was going to take it to Sheriff Moss, but Ryder caught me in his office." Zachary's expression hardened. "Where is this ledger now?" "Hidden," Josephine replied, meeting his eyes directly. "I managed to hide it before he caught me. It's still in the saloon behind a loose brick in the fireplace." "Well, you can't go back there," Mrs. Finch declared firmly. "Ryder will be looking for you as soon as he discovers you're gone." "I know," Josephine admitted, her shoulders slumping. The enormity of her situation was beginning to sink in. She had no family in El Dorado, few close friends, and now her shop and livelihood were effectively lost to her. "I don't know what I'm going to do." "For tonight, you'll stay here, Mrs. Finch said, patting her hand. "I have a spare room since the Thompson family left yesterday. Tomorrow, we'll figure something out." Zachary had remained quiet, his mind working through the problem. He had come to El Dorado following rumors of work at the Circle M ranch outside of town. He'd spent years drifting from one cattle outfit to another across Texas, Colorado, and Kansas, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But something about this woman's courage in standing up to Ryder stirred something in him. "We need to get that ledger," he said finally. "It's the only proof against Ryder, and without it, he'll keep terrorizing folks." Josephine looked at him in surprise. You don't even know me, Mr. Quint. This isn't your fight." "Zachary," he corrected her. "And maybe it wasn't my fight when I rode into town 3 days ago, but it became my fight when I pulled you out of that cellar." Mrs. Finch smiled approvingly. "Mr. Quint is right, Josephine. You can't face Ryder alone. Now, both of you get some rest. That storm won't let up until morning, I reckon, and you'll need your wits about you tomorrow." Later, lying in the narrow bed in Mrs. Finch's spare room, Josephine listened to the rain hammering against the roof and thought about the stranger who had saved her life. There was something compelling about Zachary Quint, a quiet strength and directness that she found reassuring. In Philadelphia, the men she had known had been polished and proper, their words carefully chosen. Zachary spoke plainly and acted decisively. For his part, Zachary sat in a chair by his window, watching the storm and thinking about the woman sleeping down the hall. Josephine Hayes had shown remarkable courage, both in standing up to Ryder and in surviving her ordeal in the cellar. Most women he knew would have been hysterical after such an experience, but she had maintained her composure, even thinking clearly enough to explain about the hidden ledger. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the night. The streets of El Dorado were muddy rivers, debris scattered everywhere, broken tree limbs, roof shingles, and upended barrels. Zachary assessed the damage from Mrs. Finch's porch while waiting for Josephine to join him. She appeared in a borrowed dress, her own clothes still drying after their thorough soaking. Mrs. Finch was a larger woman, and the dress hung loosely on Josephine's slender frame, but she had cinched it at the waist with a belt and somehow managed to look composed despite the circumstances. "Good morning," she said, joining him on the porch. "I want to thank you again for last night. I'm not sure I would have survived if you hadn't heard me." Zachary nodded acknowledgement of her thanks. "We need a plan," he said, getting straight to business. "Ryder will have discovered you're gone by now." "The saloon doesn't open until noon," Josephine replied. "There's a chance he hasn't checked the cellar yet." "That's a chance we can't take," Zachary countered. "We need to assume he knows you've escaped and is looking for you." "The sheriff, can he be trusted?" Josephine considered the question. "Sheriff Moss is a decent man, but he's afraid of Ryder. Most people in town are." "Then we need that ledger before we approach him," Zachary decided. "Concrete evidence might give him the backbone to stand up to Ryder." "But how can we get back into the saloon?" Josephine asked. "Ryder will recognize me immediately, and he'll be suspicious of any stranger asking questions after what happened last night." Zachary smiled, a plan forming in his mind. "I don't think he knows who helped you escape. As far as he's concerned, I'm just another drifter passing through town. I'll go to the saloon when it opens, play a few hands of poker, and see if I can get a look at that fireplace." Josephine looked doubtful. "It's too dangerous." "If he suspects anything, I've been in dangerous situations before," Zachary assured her. "I know how to handle myself. The important thing is that you stay out of sight until we have the ledger and can take it to the sheriff." Mrs. Finch emerged onto the porch, interrupting their conversation. "I've just heard from Mr. Peterson next door that Clayton Ryder is at your shop, Josephine. Apparently, he's telling folks you stole money from him and ran off during the storm." Josephine's face flushed with anger. "That's absurd. Everyone in town knows me. They won't believe him." "Don't be too sure, dear," Mrs. Finch said sadly. "Ryder has a way of making people believe what he wants them to believe, and he's offering a reward for information about your whereabouts." Zachary's jaw tightened. "All the more reason to get that ledger today. Mrs. Finch, can you keep Josephine hidden here while I go to the saloon?" The older woman nodded firmly. "No one will find her under my roof, but be careful, Mr. Quint. Ryder doesn't play by any rules but his own." At noon, Zachary pushed through the batwing doors of the Lucky Star Saloon, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. He had deliberately left his distinctive duster at Mrs. Finch's, wearing instead a plain vest over his shirt. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his features without looking suspicious. The saloon was doing a brisk business despite the early hour. Cattle drives had been coming through regularly, and cowboys with money to spend were a common sight in El Dorado. Zachary made his way to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and surveyed the room casually. The fireplace Josephine had mentioned was on the far wall, a large stone structure currently unlit due to the warm weather. A door beside it presumably led to Ryder's office. Zachary noted several men who appeared to be Ryder's employees. They had the hard eyes and alert postures of hired guns rather than ordinary bartenders or servers. "New in town?" the bartender asked as he placed a glass before Zachary. "Passing through," Zachary replied, taking a small sip of his drink. "Looking for work with one of the cattle outfits." "Might try the Circle M," the bartender suggested. "Heard they're hiring hands for the summer drive." "Might do that," Zachary agreed, dropping a coin on the bar. "Any poker games going?" The bartender nodded toward a table in the corner. "Table stakes. Minimum buy-in is $20. Zachary made his way to the poker table, where 4 men were already playing. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a carefully trimmed mustache and expensive clothes, glanced up as he approached. "Room for one more?" Zachary asked. The well-dressed man nodded, gesturing to an empty chair. "Always room for a man's money. Clayton Ryder," he introduced himself. "This is my establishment." Zachary took the offered seat, keeping his expression neutral despite the surge of anger he felt at facing the man who had locked Josephine in a flooding cellar. "Zachary Quint," he replied, placing $20 on the table. "Pleasure." For the next hour, Zachary played cards with Ryder and his companions, deliberately losing small amounts to avoid drawing attention to himself. He learned that Ryder had indeed discovered Josephine's escape. The saloon owner mentioned to one of his men that they needed to find that thieving milliner before she left town. Zachary also confirmed that the loose brick Josephine had described was visible from his position at the table, slightly displaced from the surrounding masonry. His opportunity came when a loud argument broke out at the bar, drawing everyone's attention. A cowboy, already drunk despite the early hour, was accusing another patron of cheating at dice. As Ryder rose to deal with the disturbance, Zachary casually dropped his handkerchief and bent to retrieve it, using the motion to move quickly to the fireplace and extract the ledger from its hiding place. He slipped the small book inside his vest, just as Ryder turned back toward the table. "Trouble seems to follow the cattle drives," Ryder remarked as he resumed his seat. "Now, where were we?" Zachary played a few more hands, then excused himself, claiming he needed to check on his horse before the next round. Outside, he moved quickly through the busy street, aware that once Ryder discovered the ledger was missing, he would immediately suspect anyone who had been in the saloon. Josephine was waiting anxiously at Mrs. Finch's, pacing the small parlor. Her face lit up when Zachary entered and produced the leather-bound book from inside his vest. "You got it," she exclaimed, taking the ledger and quickly flipping through its pages. "It's all here, every transaction, every bribe, every threat. This will be enough to convince Sheriff Moss to act." "We should go now," Zachary urged. "Ryder will notice it's missing soon if he hasn't already." Mrs. Finch, who had been keeping watch at the window, suddenly drew back. "Too late," she said tersely. "Ryder and 3 of his men just rode up to the sheriff's office across the street. They're talking to Moss now, and they look mighty serious." Zachary moved to the window and peered cautiously through the curtains. Sure enough, Ryder was gesturing animatedly while speaking to a thin man wearing a sheriff's badge. The lawman looked uncomfortable but was nodding in agreement to whatever Ryder was saying. "We can't go to the sheriff now," Zachary said grimly. "Ryder's turning him against us." "Then what do we do?" Josephine asked, clutching the ledger to her chest. Zachary thought quickly. "We need to get out of El Dorado. Take the ledger somewhere with an honest lawman who can't be intimidated by Ryder." "Wichita," Mrs. Finch suggested. "My sister's boy is a deputy marshal there. Frank Hollister, he's a good man, straight as an arrow. He'd listen to you." Wichita is 3 days' ride, Zachary noted. We'd need supplies, and Ryder will have men watching the general store and livery stable. I can help with that, Mrs. Finch offered. My late husband's hunting gear is still in the shed out back, including a bedroll and cooking kit. And I can ask Mr. Peterson to purchase supplies for me. He does it often enough that it won't raise suspicions. Josephine looked at Zachary, uncertainty in her eyes. You're risking a lot for someone you barely know. This isn't your fight. I made it my fight when I broke that lock, he replied simply. Besides, men like Ryder need to be stopped, or they'll keep preying on towns like El Dorado. As the day progressed, they prepared for their journey. Mrs. Finch sent Mr. Peterson for supplies while Zachary checked his horse and purchased a second mount for Josephine from a farmer on the outskirts of town, avoiding the more closely watched livery stable. Josephine carefully copied the most incriminating pages from the ledger into a small notebook that could be hidden more easily, in case they needed to abandon the original. They planned to leave after dark, when the streets would be quieter and their departure less likely to be noticed. But as twilight approached, Mrs. Finch's tense voice called them to the window once more. Ryder's men are going door to door, she reported, watching as two rough-looking men approached a house down the street. They're searching for you, Josephine. We need to leave now, Zachary decided. Before they reach this house, Mrs. Finch nodded grimly. Go out through the back garden. The alley connects to Pine Street, and from there you can reach the eastern road without passing the saloon. Quickly gathering their supplies, Josephine embraced the older woman. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Finch. I'll find a way to repay you. Just see that Ryder gets what's coming to him, Mrs. Finch replied, patting her cheek. That'll be payment enough. Zachary led the way through the garden to where he had tethered their horses. He helped Josephine mount, noting that despite her city upbringing, she sat comfortably in the saddle. You ride well, he observed as they moved quietly down the alley. My father insisted I learn, she explained. He said a proper lady should be accomplished in all things, including horsemanship. They reached Pine Street without incident and turned east, keeping their pace moderate to avoid attracting attention. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as they left El Dorado behind. Once they were beyond the town limits, Zachary increased their pace to a canter, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and Ryder before full darkness fell. They rode for several hours, following the road that would eventually lead them to Wichita. The moon rose, providing enough light to see by, though Zachary remained alert for obstacles that might injure their horses. Finally, when he sensed that both Josephine and the mounts were tiring, he led them off the road to a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. We'll rest here for a few hours, he said, dismounting and helping Josephine down from her horse. Ryder will have men searching the road, but they're unlikely to find us here until daylight. Josephine nodded wearily, her body stiff from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. While Zachary tended to the horses, she spread the bedroll Mrs. Finch had provided and gathered wood for a small fire. Is it safe to light a fire? She asked as Zachary returned. A small one kept low should be all right, he decided. The trees will hide most of the light, and we could both use something warm after riding in the night air. Soon they had a modest fire crackling, and Zachary prepared a simple meal from the supplies Mrs. Finch had sent with them. They ate in companionable silence, both lost in thought about the events that had brought them together and the journey ahead. Tell me about yourself, Zachary, Josephine said finally, curiosity overcoming her fatigue. How did you come to be in El Dorado? Zachary poked at the fire with a stick, considering his response. Not much to tell. I was born in Virginia, but my family moved west after the war. My father tried farming in Missouri but lost everything in '68 to drought. After he died, I started working cattle drives. Been doing that ever since, moving from ranch to ranch, outfit to outfit. No home? Josephine asked, trying to imagine such a rootless existence. He shrugged. The open country's been my home, never stayed in one place long enough to think about settling down. And your family? Gone now, he replied, his voice matter of fact rather than melancholy. Mother passed 2 years after father, had a brother who went to California to seek his fortune. Haven't heard from him in 5 years. Josephine felt a surge of sympathy for this solitary man who had risked so much to help her. I lost my parents too, she offered. Father last year, mother when I was 16. That's why I came west to make a fresh start. And instead you found Clayton Ryder, Zachary observed. Not just him, Josephine corrected, meeting his gaze across the fire. I found someone willing to break a lock and face down a dangerous man for a complete stranger. That counts for something. Zachary looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. We should get some sleep. I'll take first watch, wake you in a few hours. I'm not sure I could sleep knowing Ryder's men might be searching for us, Josephine admitted. Try, Zachary encouraged. Tomorrow will be a long day. Josephine settled onto the bedroll, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Despite her protests, exhaustion soon overcame her anxiety and she fell into a deep sleep. Zachary watched her for a moment, noting how the firelight played across her features, softening them in repose. There was a delicacy to her that belied the strength she had shown in standing up to Ryder and enduring the Cellar ordeal. He turned his attention to their surroundings, listening to the night sounds, the murmur of the creek, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the occasional call of a night bird. Nothing suggested pursuit, but Zachary remained vigilant. He had encountered men like Ryder before and knew they didn't surrender their power easily. The night passed without incident, and they set out again at first light, keeping to less traveled paths when possible to avoid detection. Josephine proved to be a resilient traveling companion, never complaining despite the discomfort of long hours in the saddle and the uncertainty that lay ahead. By midday, they had covered a considerable distance, but Zachary's experienced eye noted signs that their horses needed rest. They stopped by another creek, dismounting to stretch their legs and allow the animals to drink and graze. How much farther to Wichita? Josephine asked, splashing cool water on her face. At this pace, we should reach it by tomorrow evening, Zachary replied, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuers. Assuming we don't run into trouble. Trouble, as it turned out, was not far behind them. As they prepared to mount up and continue their journey, Zachary heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, several horses, moving at speed. Ryder's coming, he said tersely. Could be Ryder's men. Josephine's face paled, but she moved quickly to gather their belongings. Can we outrun them? Zachary assessed their mounts critically. Not with these horses, not after the ground we've already covered. We need to hide. He led her and the horses into a dense thicket of brush and trees near the creek, where they would be concealed from the road. They crouched low, holding the horses' reins tightly to keep them quiet as the riders approached. 4 men appeared on the road, moving at a determined pace. Zachary recognized 2 of them from the Lucky Star Saloon. They slowed as they reached the creek, and one dismounted to examine the ground. They've been here, the man called to his companions. Tracks are fresh, can't be more than an hour ahead of us. Ryder wants the woman alive, another man reminded him. He's got special plans for her after what she tried to pull. Josephine shuddered beside Zachary, who placed a reassuring hand on her arm. They remained perfectly still as the men watered their horses and discussed their pursuit. "What about the cowboy?" one asked. "Ryder don't care about him, long as we get the ledger back," came the reply. "Kill him if he gives you trouble." The men mounted up and continued along the road, following the tracks that Zachary and Josephine had left before veering into the thicket. Zachary waited until they were well out of sight before speaking. "They'll realize their mistake when the tracks run out," he said quietly. "We need to move in a different direction." "But Wichita," Josephine began. "We'll still get there," Zachary assured her, "just by a different route. I know this country well enough to find our way without using the main road." They emerged from their hiding place and mounted up, turning southwest away from the road. Zachary led them across open prairie, keeping to the low ground when possible to minimize their visibility. His knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as he found creek crossings and natural landmarks to guide their way. As the sun began to set, Zachary spotted what he had been searching for: an abandoned homestead nestled in a small valley. The cabin was still largely intact, though the roof had partially collapsed at one end. "We'll spend the night here," he decided. "It's sheltered from view, and we can secure the horses in what's left of the barn." Josephine dismounted, her legs trembling with fatigue. "Do you think we've lost them?" "For now," Zachary replied honestly. "But they know we're heading for Wichita. We'll need to be careful when we approach the town." Inside the cabin, they found a stone fireplace that was still usable and enough intact furniture to provide basic comfort. Zachary built a small fire while Josephine prepared their evening meal from the dwindling supplies. "Tell me about your life in Philadelphia," Zachary requested as they ate. "What was it like before you came west?" Josephine smiled at the memory of her former life. "Proper, structured. Every day had its routine: morning calls, afternoon teas, evening socials. My father was a merchant, not wealthy but respected. He expected me to marry well, but when his business failed and his debts mounted, my prospects dried up along with his credit." "So you came to Kansas to start fresh," Zachary observed. "With what little inheritance my mother left me," Josephine confirmed. "Enough to buy the millinery shop and a small room above it. I was doing well until Ryder arrived and began demanding protection payments." "You were brave to stand against him," Zachary said, his admiration evident. Josephine shook her head. "Not brave, desperate. When he raised the amount he demanded, I knew my business wouldn't survive. I'd heard rumors about his ledger from other shopkeepers. I thought if I could get it to Sheriff Moss, we might all be free of Ryder's grip. And now we're taking it to Wichita instead," Zachary concluded. "If we make it there," Josephine added softly. "We will," Zachary assured her with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Get some sleep." "I'll keep watch." This time, Josephine didn't argue. She settled onto a makeshift bed Zachary had prepared from the bedroll and some old blankets found in the cabin. Soon, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Zachary watched her from his position by the door, rifle across his knees. In the firelight, with her guard down, Josephine Hayes looked younger and more vulnerable than the determined woman who had faced down Ryder and endured a harrowing escape. Something protective stirred in Zachary's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years of solitary wandering. The night passed quietly, and they set out at dawn, continuing their southwesterly course. By midday, they had reached a point where they needed to turn southeast toward Wichita. The horses were showing signs of fatigue, but Zachary pushed on, knowing that safety lay in reaching the town as quickly as possible. Late in the afternoon, as they crested a low hill, Zachary spotted riders in the distance, at least 6 of them, moving purposefully in their direction. "Riders," he warned Josephine. "Too many to be coincidence." "Riders men?" she asked, anxiety evident in her voice. "Most likely," Zachary replied grimly. They must have guessed our route and circled ahead of us. He scanned the landscape, looking for any feature that might offer protection or concealment. The open prairie provided few options, but about half a mile to their east, he spotted a line of trees that suggested another creek. "There," he pointed. "If we can reach those trees before they spot us, we might be able to follow the creek into rougher country where they'll have trouble tracking us." They urged their tired horses into a gallop, making for the distant trees. For several minutes, it seemed they might reach the sanctuary undetected, but then a shout went up from behind them. The pursuing riders had spotted them and were changing course to intercept. "They're gaining on us," Josephine called, glancing over her shoulder at the closing distance. "Keep riding," Zachary instructed, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Head for the trees, I'll slow them down." "Zachary, no, go," he commanded, reining in his horse and wheeling to face the pursuers. Josephine hesitated only a moment before continuing toward the creek. Zachary dismounted, leading his horse behind a small rise that offered minimal cover. He took careful aim as the first riders came into range. He fired once, the shot kicking up dirt directly in front of the lead horse, causing it to rear in panic. The rider struggled to maintain control as his companions scattered, seeking cover of their own. Zachary fired again, deliberately missing but creating enough of a threat to slow their advance. Using the confusion he'd created, Zachary remounted and raced after Josephine, who had reached the trees and was waiting anxiously for him. Together they plunged into the creek bed, following its winding course through increasingly rough terrain. The trees thickened around them, offering better concealment as they pushed deeper into what appeared to be a heavily wooded ravine. "We can't keep this pace much longer," Josephine warned as her horse stumbled on the rocky ground. "The horses are about spent." Zachary nodded his agreement. "There should be a place up ahead where we can rest them. The creek narrows and the banks get steeper, easier to defend if they follow us this far." The spot Zachary had remembered was a natural bottleneck where the creek passed between two high banks. The approach from behind them would force any pursuers to come single file along the creek bed, making them vulnerable. He helped Josephine dismount and led both horses to a small clearing just beyond the narrows where they could graze on the sparse grass. "Will they follow us in here?" Josephine asked, her voice hushed as though the pursuers might already be within earshot. "Some might," Zachary replied, checking his ammunition. "Others will probably circle around, try to cut us off ahead, but this buys us time to rest the horses and figure out our next move." As if on cue, a distant shout echoed through the ravine, followed by the sound of horses splashing through water. "They're coming," Josephine whispered, fear evident in her eyes. Zachary positioned himself at the narrows, rifle ready. "Stay with the horses," he instructed. "If things go badly, don't wait for me. Ride for Wichita, it's less than a day's journey from here." "I'm not leaving you," Josephine insisted, moving to his side with determination. Before Zachary could argue, the first rider appeared around a bend in the creek, moving cautiously. Zachary recognized him as one of the men from the saloon, a hired gun named Malone who had a reputation for ruthlessness. "That's far enough," Zachary called out, his rifle trained on the approaching rider. Malone reined in his horse, his hand hovering near his holstered pistol. "No need for this to get bloody, Cowboy," he called back. "Just hand over the woman and the ledger, and you can ride away." "Not going to happen," Zachary replied steadily. "Turn around and tell Ryder his days of terrorizing El Dorado are over." Malone laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the ravine walls. "Ryder owns half the county, including the sheriff. You think one little book is going to change that?" "I think a federal marshal might take an interest," Zachary responded. especially when that book shows Ryder's been rustling cattle across state lines. A flash of uncertainty crossed Malone's face, suggesting this was information he hadn't been privy to. He glanced over his shoulder, presumably at companions still out of Zachary's line of sight. "Last chance," Malone warned, turning back to Zachary. "There are 6 of us and only one of you." "Bad odds for you," Zachary observed calmly. "In this narrow passage, you can only come at me one at a time." Malone's expression hardened. "We don't need to come through here at all. Simmons and Watson are already circling around to the other side. You're trapped, Cowboy." Zachary had anticipated this tactic, but hoped they'd have more time before the flanking riders got into position. He glanced at Josephine, whose determined expression had not wavered despite the increasingly dire situation. "The ledger," she said quietly, reaching into her pocket and extracting the small notebook into which she had copied the most damning evidence. "Even if they catch us, we can make sure this reaches the marshal." Understanding her intent, Zachary nodded. If they could hide the copy somewhere along their route, there was a chance it might be found later, even if they didn't make it to Wichita themselves. A shot rang out from somewhere above and behind them, striking a rock near Zachary's feet. The flanking riders had reached the rim of the ravine and now had the high ground. "Time's up," Malone called with satisfaction. "Throw down your weapon and step away from the woman." Zachary's mind raced through their options, each more desperate than the last. They couldn't go forward without facing the men on the rim, couldn't go back through the narrows where Malone and his companions waited, and couldn't climb the steep banks of the ravine without making themselves perfect targets. Then, as if in answer to an unspoken prayer, a new voice called out from the rim of the ravine, one that belonged to neither Ryder's men nor anyone Zachary recognized. "Federal Marshal, everyone hold your fire." Zachary looked up to see a man in a dusty black coat standing at the edge of the ravine, a badge gleaming on his chest and a rifle in his hands. Beside him stood 2 deputies, similarly armed. Malone cursed under his breath, clearly recognizing the authority in the newcomer's voice. "This is private business, Marshal," he called up. "Nothing that concerns the law. When 6 armed men chase a man and woman across the prairie, it becomes my concern," the marshal replied firmly. "Now all of you drop your weapons. My deputies have the rest of your group covered." For a tense moment, Zachary thought Malone might resist, but then the hired gun slowly removed his gun belt and tossed it aside. From above, Zachary could hear similar sounds as the men on the rim surrendered to the deputies. The marshal made his way carefully down the steep bank to where Zachary and Josephine stood. He was a man of middle years, with a weathered face and alert eyes that missed nothing. "Marshal Frank Hollister," he introduced himself. "And you would be?" "Zachary Quint," Zachary replied, lowering his rifle but not yet relinquishing it. "This is Miss Josephine Hayes. We're heading to Wichita to see Deputy Marshal Hollister." The marshal's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That would be my son. What business do you have with him?" Josephine stepped forward, holding out the ledger. "Evidence of criminal activity by Clayton Ryder of El Dorado. Extortion, cattle rustling, bribery of officials. Your son was recommended to us as someone who couldn't be bought." Marshal Hollister took the ledger, flipping through its pages with growing interest. "Been hearing rumors about Ryder for months, but nothing solid enough to act on." He looked up at Josephine with newfound respect. "This changes things." As the deputies rounded up Malone and his companions, Marshal Hollister explained that they had been tracking a gang of cattle rustlers when they heard gunfire and diverted to investigate. It was pure chance or perhaps providence that had brought them to the ravine at precisely the moment Zachary and Josephine needed them most. "My camp is about 2 miles from here," the marshal offered. "Your horses look like they could use rest, and I'd like to hear the full story behind this ledger." That evening, seated around Marshal Hollister's campfire, Josephine recounted everything from Ryder's arrival in El Dorado to her discovery of the ledger, her imprisonment in the cellar, and Zachary's timely rescue. The marshal listened attentively, occasionally asking questions but mostly allowing her to tell the story in her own way. "Brave thing you did, Miss Hayes," he commented when she had finished. "Not many would stand up to a man like Ryder." "I couldn't have done it without Zachary," she replied, glancing at the cowboy who sat quietly at her side. "He risked everything for a stranger." Marshal Hollister studied Zachary with interest. "You a lawman in another territory, Quint?" Zachary shook his head. "Just a cowhand." "One with a strong sense of right and wrong," the marshal observed. "We could use more like you wearing a badge." The suggestion hung in the air, neither accepted nor rejected as the conversation turned to more immediate concerns. Marshal Hollister confirmed that the ledger contained enough evidence to bring charges against Ryder, not just in Kansas but potentially in federal court for crimes that crossed state lines. "I'll send a wire to the federal marshal in Topeka," he decided. "With this evidence and your testimony, Miss Hayes, we should be able to get an arrest warrant for Ryder." "What about Sheriff Moss?" Josephine asked. "The ledger shows he accepted bribes from Ryder." "He'll face charges too," the marshal assured her. "No one's above the law, badge or no badge." The next morning, their party set out for Wichita, the prisoners under guard by the deputies while Zachary and Josephine rode alongside Marshal Hollister. The older man proved to be good company, sharing stories of his 30 years in law enforcement, and listening with genuine interest to Josephine's description of life in Philadelphia. Zachary remained quieter, his thoughts turning increasingly to what would happen once they reached Wichita. With the ledger safely delivered and Ryder's men in custody, his role in Josephine's life would naturally come to an end. The realization brought an unexpected sense of loss. They reached Wichita late that afternoon, a bustling cattle town that dwarfed El Dorado in size and activity. Marshal Hollister led them directly to his office, where a young man who bore a striking resemblance to him greeted them warmly. "Deputy Marshal Frank Hollister, Jr., the marshal introduced his son. "Frank, these are the folks I wired you about Miss Josephine Hayes and Mr. Zachary Quint." The deputies shook their hands cordially. "Father's message said you had evidence against Clayton Ryder. We've been trying to build a case against him for months." While the marshal and his son reviewed the ledger and began the process of drafting arrest warrants, Zachary accompanied Josephine to a hotel recommended by the marshal as both comfortable and secure. The journey had taken its toll on both of them, and the prospect of clean beds and hot baths was appealing. "Will you return to El Dorado now?" Josephine asked as they stood in the hotel lobby after securing rooms. Zachary hesitated. He had no real ties to El Dorado, had merely been passing through when fate put Josephine in his path. But the thought of simply riding away, of never seeing her again, left an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. "I should at least stay until the warrants are served," he replied. "Make sure Ryder is properly arrested." Relief flashed across Josephine's face, quickly masked by a more neutral expression. "Of course, that makes sense. And what then?" "I don't know," Zachary admitted honestly. "I've never stayed in one place very long." Josephine nodded, a touch of disappointment evident despite her attempt to hide it. "Well, I'm grateful for everything you've done, regardless of what comes next." They parted ways to their respective rooms, each lost in thoughts of the other, and the unlikely bond that had formed between them over the past few days. The following morning brought news that federal warrants had been issued for Ryder and several of his associates, including Sheriff Moss. Marshal Hollister and a contingent of deputies would ride for El Dorado immediately. He invited Zachary to accompany them, an offer Zachary accepted without hesitation. "Will you be safe here?" Zachary asked Josephine as they said their goodbyes in the hotel dining room. "Deputy Hollister has arranged for a female deputy to stay with me," she assured him. "And the hotel has been instructed to allow no visitors without my approval." Zachary nodded, satisfied with the precautions. "I'll return as soon as Ryder is in custody." "Be careful," Josephine urged, impulsively reaching out to touch his arm. "Ryder won't surrender easily." The ride back to El Dorado was faster than their journey away from it, with fresh horses and no need for the circuitous route they had taken to avoid pursuit. They reached the town just after noon the following day, creating quite a stir as Marshal Hollister and his deputies rode openly down Main Street toward the Lucky Star Saloon. Word of their approach must have reached Ryder, for the saloon was unusually quiet when they entered, its regular patrons having apparently decided that business elsewhere was prudent. Ryder himself stood behind the bar, a deceptively calm expression on his face. "Marshal," he acknowledged coolly. "What brings federal law to my establishment?" Marshal Hollister unfolded the warrant and placed it on the bar. "Clayton Ryder, you're under arrest for extortion, bribery of public officials, cattle rustling, and false imprisonment. There are additional charges pending." Ryder's composure faltered briefly before he regained control. "Ridiculous. Who's making these accusations? That thieving milliner who stole from me and ran off." "Miss Hayes provided evidence," the marshal confirmed, "but your own ledger makes the strongest case against you." "Your men are already in custody, Ryder. They'll be eager to make deals to save themselves." Ryder's hand moved toward his jacket, but Zachary was faster, drawing his revolver and training it on the saloon owner before he could reach whatever weapon he concealed. "Don't," Zachary advised quietly. "It won't end well for you." For a tense moment, it seemed Ryder might still attempt something desperate, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He allowed himself to be handcuffed and led from the saloon to a waiting wagon that would transport him and the now arrested Sheriff Moss to Wichita for trial. The town of El Dorado seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as news of Ryder's arrest spread. People emerged from shops and homes to watch as the procession of lawmen and prisoners made its way out of town. Some even cheered, though most maintained a cautious silence until the dust from the departing wagons had settled. Zachary remained in El Dorado for 2 more days, helping Marshal Hollister's deputies secure evidence from Ryder's office and interview townspeople who had been victimized by his schemes. Many were reluctant to speak at first, fear of retribution still strong despite Ryder's arrest. But gradually, the full extent of his criminal enterprise became clear. When Zachary finally rode back to Wichita, he carried with him statements from over a dozen El Dorado residents, all testifying to Ryder's methods of intimidation and extortion. He also carried something else, a growing certainty about what he wanted for his future. Josephine was sitting in the hotel garden when he arrived, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She rose quickly to meet him as he crossed the lawn toward her. "You're back," she said, her relief evident. "Is it done? Is Ryder in custody?" "He's in the Wichita jail," Zachary confirmed, "along with Sheriff Moss and 6 of his men. Marshal Hollister says they'll stand trial within the month." "And El Dorado, already recovering," Zachary reported with a smile. The town council appointed a temporary sheriff, an honest man named Jenkins, who stood up to Ryder once and got beaten for his trouble. People are returning to the shops they'd abandoned out of fear, your millinery included. Josephine's expression turned thoughtful. I should go back, I suppose. Rebuild my business. Is that what you want? Zachary asked carefully. She hesitated. I don't know. After everything that's happened, going back to trimming hats seems small somehow. Marshal Hollister mentioned that Wichita could use a respectable millinery, Zachary offered. Said his wife complains about having to order her hats from Kansas City. Josephine looked at him with surprise. You've been discussing my business prospects with the marshal, among other things, Zachary acknowledged. He also mentioned that the cattle business is booming here, that a man with experience could do well working for one of the larger outfits, or even starting his own someday. A man like you, Josephine observed, a note of hope in her voice. A man like me, Zachary confirmed. Who's thinking it might be time to stop drifting and put down some roots. In Wichita? Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zachary nodded, taking a step closer to her. If there was a reason to stay. Josephine's eyes searched his face, finding there the answer to the question she hadn't quite dared to ask. I think, she said carefully, that rebuilding in a new place might be exactly what I need. A fresh start, without Ryder's shadow hanging over everything. It wouldn't be easy, Zachary cautioned. Starting over never is. I'm not afraid of hard work, Josephine replied with the same determination he had admired from the beginning. And I wouldn't be alone this time. No, Zachary agreed, reaching out to take her hand. You wouldn't be alone. The trial of Clayton Ryder and his associates became one of the most talked about legal proceedings in Kansas that year. Josephine's testimony, supported by the detailed records in Ryder's ledger, and corroborated by numerous witnesses from El Dorado, ensured that he received a sentence of 20 years in the territorial prison. By the time the trial concluded, Josephine had secured a small storefront on Wichita's main thoroughfare for her new millinery. Zachary, true to his word, had taken a position with one of the larger cattle operations, his experience and reliability quickly earning him the trust of his employers. They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony attended by Marshal Hollister and his family, Mrs. Finch, who had closed her boarding house in El Dorado to move closer to her sister in Wichita, and a small gathering of the new friends they had made in their adopted home. Did you ever imagine, Josephine asked as they danced at their wedding celebration, when you heard me pounding on that cellar door during the storm, that we'd end up here? Zachary smiled, drawing her closer. I knew from the moment I broke that lock that my life had changed. I just didn't know how completely. And do you regret it? She asked, a teasing note in her voice. Trading your freedom to wander for a wife and a home? Never, Zachary replied with conviction. Some locks are worth breaking, Josephine Hayes Quint. Especially when they lead to the greatest treasure a man could find. 5 years later, the Quint family had grown to include twin boys, Samuel and James. Their father's love of the outdoors already evident in their constant exploration of the fenced yard behind the comfortable house Zachary had built on the outskirts of Wichita. Josephine's millinery had prospered, gaining a reputation for quality and style that drew customers from surrounding towns and ranches. Zachary had advanced from ranch hand to foreman, and eventually to partner in a successful cattle operation. His fair dealing and straightforward manner had earned him respect throughout the region, and there was even talk of him running for town council in the upcoming election. On stormy nights, when the Kansas wind howled around their solid home, Zachary would sometimes find Josephine standing by the window, a distant look in her eyes. He knew she was remembering that cellar in El Dorado, the fear and desperation she had felt as the water rose around her, and the sound of a lock breaking that had changed both their lives forever. Thinking about that night, he asked on one such occasion, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't heard me," she admitted, leaning back against his chest. "If you hadn't decided to break that lock." "But I did hear you," Zachary reminded her gently. "And I'll always be grateful for the storm that drove me from Mrs. Finch's leaky room and past that cellar door at exactly the right moment." Josephine turned in his arms, her face upturned to his. "As will I," she said softly. "Every single day." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the walls of the home they had built together, Zachary and Josephine Quint had found a shelter more secure than any lock could protect the enduring bond between two people whose lives had been joined by chance, but sustained by choice. Each day, a continuation of the journey that had begun in a storm-lashed moment of courage and compassion.